Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. A recent report by the state's non-partisan Little Hoover Commission has stated that, quote, California is a story of 2 economies, with economic success largely based in coastal California. In short, California's economic success has largely eluded inland California. What are the causes of this disparity, and what can be done to encourage more equitable regional development? Our guest is Pedro Nava. He's the chairperson of the Little Hoover Commission that recently conducted an in-depth study of these issues. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Good to be here. Thank you.
I want to ask you, your report puts California's regional disparities in stark contrast, comparing valley cities like Fresno, Visalia, Bakersfield to coastal cities over the last few decades. What did you find?
Well, we found that the coastal cities have done very, very well, and the inland areas have been left behind. And as an example, back in 1970, you could compare Visalia to Menlo Park, and the numbers were very similar. But by 2021, there were dramatic differences. So the average salary in Menlo Park in 2021 was the second highest in the United States, and had a number of college graduates compared to Visalia, had the second lowest percentage of college educated in the U.S. and one of the lowest average salaries. In 1980, personal income in Fresno, Bakersfield, and Inland Empire was equal to the national average, but by 2020, it trailed by as much as 25%. So, yeah, not good.
Yeah, so the economic disparity between the Valley and coastal California hasn't always existed. In short, it's not something that's been endemic to the Valley. So why has economic development in the Valley lagged coastal California over the last 40 to 50 years?
Yeah, part of it has been the sort of industries that the Valley have. They're not diversified. They tend to be focused in those areas that have a large number of lower paid positions and that don't have a lot of diversity, so to speak. So it makes a huge difference. So climate change and environmental pollution have had a dramatic impact on the inland areas of California. Construction was driving growth for a while in the inland areas, but then you had the recession and the collapse. So that sort of spelled a bad scenario.
You know, one of the things you note as a major contributor is the small share of jobs that exist in the Valley in what you call tradable sectors. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting concept in that, you know, we like to think that you want to help develop economic activity within your community and within your area, and that you're trading back and forth amongst each other. And it turns out that really is a recipe for lack of growth. Tradable sectors means that, for example, in Fresno County, agriculture is a dynamic and a very successful enterprise. However, the value that is added to the processing of food isn't performed in Fresno County. So you plant the food, you harvest it, you put it on a truck or a train, and you ship it outside of the county. The processing, which turns it into a much higher value product, isn't done where the food is grown. So the benefits and the increased value of processing the food is not in your hometown, it's somewhere far away. Tradable sectors means you build something, you make something that you then can trade outside of your region. That's a better formula for success.
Yeah, people have talked about that, the value added to agriculture. That's one thing we're kind of lacking here. You know, one might think that the pandemic actually may have helped improve the Valley's economic prospects. I mean, with the growth of remote work, coupled with the allure of lower housing prices here in the Valley, that might result in better paying jobs in the Valley. Is that what you find, or have you found that?
Well, it's a mixed bag. It doesn't necessarily work all the time. I mean, we have found in the urban centers, people got used to working at home. And so the urban centers are suffering because folks don't want to go back full time to downtown. they don't go back downtown. That means the businesses that are necessary for the downtown worker, they're not doing well. The businesses in your community are doing better because you're working from home. But we also see that there are rising property values that are attributable to people working away from home, so that housing in some areas becomes more expensive when you have the scenario of work from home.
Yeah, you quote a Brookings Institution member who advised the commission that, quote, you can have economic growth without inclusion, but you can't have inclusion without growth, unquote. What did he mean by that?
Well, what they mean is that, I mean, we've also heard a saying that rising tide lifts all boats. And for economic development, if you only focus on those people who are already prepared and able and willing to go into a new area or a new endeavor, that means you're going to leave a lot of people behind. Certain economic areas of the state specialize in a particular industry. Well, if you're moving away from that industry, if you don't do everything you can to ensure that people receive the training so that they can grow with the new position, that is going to have hardship in the places where you live. People left behind don't do well, and then as a result, communities fail.
Yeah, so up next, we're going to talk a little bit more about inclusive economic development. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. A recent Little Hoover Commission report on equitable economic development across California has noted that, quote, the American economy faces twin challenges: growing economic disparities between regions and a lack of inclusive growth within regions. We're talking with Pedro Nava. He's the chairperson of the state's non-partisan Little Hoover Commission. You know, the commission's report notes that regional economic development strategies have traditionally focused on tax or financial incentives to attract businesses to a region. However, researchers are now saying that regions should focus on developing a regional ecosystem that enhances competitiveness, productivity, and the ability for regional businesses to grow. The Brookings Institution, for one, has identified 5 components that underline the economic success of a region. Can you briefly describe those 5 components?
Yeah, and thank goodness that they're taking a more sophisticated approach, because if you do the other way, you're not really reaching either the industry or the people that you need. So, for example, we mentioned traded sectors, and so this is where you actually you satisfy a market outside of your local economy. You get better jobs, higher paying jobs with a better level of training, so it's better for folks all the way around. The second aspect of it is talent. In other words, you have to have people available to do the jobs, the new jobs. And you also have to have people who are willing to be trained, and you have to have the ability to train them. So that talks about a partnership with businesses, with educational institutions. And then innovation, right? How do you want to innovate in your community so that you attract the kinds of businesses that are forward-looking, not those that are tied to the past and that have been unsuccessful? Infrastructure is the next category. In other words, you got to have high-speed internet. You got to have the broadband. You have to have all of the infrastructure or the architecture to support the new endeavor in order to be successful in a different kind of economy. The last area that they talk about is governance. In other words, boards of supervisors and city councils. Do they encourage, do they foster, do they nurture the environment and the infrastructure and the architecture and the regulations in order to ensure that businesses are successful and they're moving forward, and how they bring people in to actually do the work?
You know, we recently had a program about downtown revitalization in Fresno, and one of our guests was Mayor Dyer. And a person in the audience who's trying to start a comedy club in Fresno, and he has chains all over the state, was talking about the difference he had in dealing with Fresno versus San Francisco. San Francisco couldn't get a call back. In Fresno, the mayor picked up the phone and called him. And as a result, it looks like that comedy club is going to be opening up in Fresno in the next 6 to 9 months. So that speaks to the importance of governance. So what about are some of the other types of interventions that regional leaders have to focus on to advance their development priorities?
Well, there's a thing called industrial cluster strategies. So that means if you have a certain kind of business, you want to try as best you can to foster those affiliated businesses that will support the primary business, but that also generate jobs on their own. So, for example, again, agriculture, if you're doing the agriculture, if you can create the processing facilities within your community, you've now expanded the base of people for jobs. It becomes more stable, and there's a greater demand for those kinds of employees. One of the things that we've learned, for example, with the automobile strikes, is that it impacts affiliated businesses. So Ford might not necessarily make the kind of door lock that you need. There's a company that does provide it. They may not make the airbags in-house. Somebody else provides it and sells it to them. So you got job training and upskilling. So if you want to do work, let's say in Kern County, that has a history of working with the petroleum and oil industry, don't ignore the benefit of their experience and what they know how to do. Apply that to the new industry, such as biofuels and things that are related to that. You also need business incubators because that helps bring about new ideas. It encourages and fosters innovation, which is important in a community. You want to make sure that your university extension services and your community colleges are paying attention to how the region is growing and developing so that they prepare curriculum and job training courses for it. Give you an example, you've got WET, Water, Energy, and the Tech Center at Fresno State. That's a state-supported innovation hub that goes a long way towards keeping things moving forward.
Now, I want to mention or ask you about Fresno, Stanislaus, Kern County, the Valley. You said they have some unique strengths and opportunities that give us a competitive advantage. What are they?
Well, for Fresno, again, advanced agricultural production, green manufacturing, business services, including second office locations, because property values are positive in the Fresno area. You're not going to pay as much for square footage as if you went to a coastal city. Bakersfield and Kern, look at biofuels, carbon capture, storage, aerospace. Stanislaus, again, bioindustrial manufacturing, including biofuels, food manufacturing, what they call a circular economy, modular prefab housing, and agricultural equipment and manufacturing.
Okay, so up next, we're going to talk about some of the more successful regional initiatives. You may be surprised that many of them are in our backyard. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Report. We're talking with Pedro Nava. He's the chairperson of the state's non-partisan Little Hoover Commission about a recent report the commission issued on equitable economic development across California. There have been a number of regional coalitions that have launched initiatives to promote more inclusive economic development. One really big example is Fresno Drive, developing the region's Inclusive and Vibrant Economy Initiative. Can you describe what it is and some of the initiatives it's working on?
Yeah, you've got a lot to be proud of with Fresno Drive. I mean, first of all, they got a 10-year investment. They launched it in 2019, led by the Central Valley Community Foundation. They have a development plan that outlines a $4 billion investment program aimed at supporting economic development. You've got 18 constituent initiatives included in that. They also received a $15 million Irvine grant, and they're working with the Fresno Economic Development Corporation and Harvard Business School to develop a community scorecard because if you can't manage what you don't measure, and it's important to take measurements of the sorts of things that you want to move forward on.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Some of the stuff that are developing are a Fresno Merced Future of Food Innovation Corridor, creating a K through 16 education pathway, upskilling opportunities, building wealth in communities of color, expanding permanent affordable housing, revitalizing downtown. Lots of initiatives going on through Fresno Drive. Let me ask you another question. What are the lessons that are learned from this and other regional economic initiatives?
Well, it's a new and important way of looking at economic development. It used to be that you'd think, all right, give somebody a tax cut, give them some cuts in regulation, help them clear a pad, build a factory. What we've come to understand is that economic development is basically an ecology. It is an environment that supports the inclusion of the people from the community, the workforce in the community, the business interest in the community. In other words, all of those folks that have an investment in success need to be at the table talking about how to get there. You don't get there first and then bring people along because you're going to leave them out. They're not going to really understand what you've done and they won't help you to succeed. So it's long-term challenges, leadership, including people from all aspects of the community and building trust.
And I think that last one is particularly important, building trust, because if you can't trust each other, then you really can't get anything done. It's like any type of negotiations or agreement. Both sides have to trust the other, which I think is very important. While your report notes that there has been a long history of regionalism in California, the state really generally has really given little support or attention to regional economic planning. That seems to have changed with the Community Economic Resilience Fund. What can you tell us about the fund and Governor Newsom's Regions Rise Together initiative?
Well, some people are going to hear CERF, C-E-R-F, which stands for, as you said, Community Economic Resilience Fund. It is a very aggressive approach to providing money to regions of the state. They identified 13 regions. They put 600 million initially in state funding to support the regional economic development. They also, interestingly enough, made grants of $5 million to each region as basically kind of a seed money to help with the planning. Again, you can't measure, right? You can't manage what you don't measure. So the 5 million was the way to get people started on the planning, so they had money to put that work together.
Yeah, a lot of people say, oh, they kind of poo-poo the 5 million. Oh, that's not a lot of money. And then I think about it's only in state government, it's only 5 million, not a lot of money. But if you think back when Governor Schwarzenegger did his executive order and created the California Partnership for the San Joaquin Valley, that started with 5 million, and that had significant impact. And this is just 5 million just to get it started, so it could have a big impact here. So what are the more significant challenges that the Community Economic Resilience Fund is likely to face?
Well, it's like everything else. You got to balance the priorities, and that's why it's so important to have everybody in the community represented at these conversations and at the discussions, so that you get. So, I have a friend who talks about sometimes when you deal with problems, you want to boil the ocean because you have too many options. You have to balance the priorities, put together those things that are the most important for the largest number of people. Then you also got to keep track of time and funding, right? How you bring in the money. You've got the 13 regions that are established under SURF. The conversations about priorities are going to take place there. And then those regions will look to bring money together from different sources. I will tell you, the Little Hoover Commission report on appendix number 1 has 4 pages of agencies, the amount of money that those agencies receive and how it's supposed to be used. And it's a good place for organizations to take a look at how they can get engaged and involved.
Well, let me ask you this. How do you ensure that the state, or does the state ensure actually, that SURF doesn't become another one-time program that has limited impact?
Well, that's going to be an important part of what the 13 regions do in terms of advocacy for their work, for early success and putting together plans and showing that they can coordinate, that they can work together, that inclusion and making sure that everybody in the community is a part of reaching all of the necessary solutions. So the Little Hoover Commission has identified $9.3 billion in one-time funding, but we've also got $1.2 billion in annual funding in the state budget. So it's important for the regions and for the elected representatives of those areas to be advocates for continued funding through the state budget. Okay.
Well, up next, inclusive economic development's going to be a one and done, or can it have a more long-lasting impact in places like the Valley? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Pedro Nava, the chairperson of the state's non-partisan Little Hoover Commission, about a recent report the commission issued on equitable economic development across California. It notes that, quote, the overarching question is how the state can sustain and scale regional collaboration and economic development beyond SURF, unquote. Let's talk about that for a moment. One thing you suggest in your report is to prioritize more disadvantaged regions and subregions. What do you mean by that?
Well, we talked earlier about how the coast of California is doing really well and the inland is not so well. Well, you know what that means? That means that there is a deliberate decision that money and resources be directed to the inland part of the state of California because they deserve the opportunity to get caught up. So the state has to be active in that. Your local electeds have to be active in that. You have to keep in mind and track where the money is going and how it's spent, and the state has to be an advocate for lifting up the economies of those parts of California that have fallen behind.
Yeah, so it's interesting that I would argue that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and that really is kind of what you're saying here, is that the weakest link, frankly, economically in California is the Valley. And there's actually, when they were talking about dividing the state into different regions and have different states breaking California up, they said if you did that, you'd have the richest state in the nation, basically San Jose, adjacent to the poorest state in the nation, the Valley. And I thought that was pretty eye-opening. Anyway, a second suggestion is that the state should provide greater clarity and strategic focus to SURF. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, there are 13 regions, and I think what the state did not want to, because we've learned that one size doesn't fit all. So the regions have been permitted a fair amount of flexibility so that the plans that they develop reflect the reality on the ground. Now, you got to be careful that it doesn't drift so far away from the objective, which is increased economic development, inclusion, and better economic prosperity for people in the inland parts of California. So You still have to stay engaged. The state has to stay engaged. They have to monitor the progress and they keep track of the direction that the regions are moving in order to ensure that you don't lose sight.
Yeah, it's interesting. In your report, you talk about some of the R&D money coming into universities like Fresno State and UC Merced. Very significant. You had $54 million on R&D in 2020, $816 million for UC Davis. I mean, there's a lot of money that could be spent here in the Valley to improve ag and ag tech and entrepreneurship along those lines. Right. So let me ask you this. Another suggestion in your report is to, quote, increase regional capacity for inclusive development, unquote. What do you mean by that?
Well, again, a rising tide lifts all boats. So an inclusive economy means that at all different levels of the economy, those participants, whether you be highly educated and highly paid, or others that aren't so highly paid or highly educated, have an opportunity to succeed. We have learned over time that the strongest communities are those that provide as best it can for everyone in its community. Now, that also means that in all likelihood, you'll increase amenities. In the city where you live, amenities attract people with higher incomes and higher education levels, which is what you want to do in order to stabilize economic development.
Yeah, that's really, really important because I think a lot of people think that when you talk about parks, and I happen to be a fan of trails, that, that's just kind of nice additional stuff for a community. Actually, it's an economic issue because high-level executives or people that are highly skilled want to live in a nice area. They have options, and if you can't give them a nice community, they'll frankly go elsewhere. So it's an economic calling card, among other things. In your report, you talk about improved state coordination. State coordination, that sounds like a new concept.
Well, one of the things that Little Hoover has discovered over time when we prepare our reports and our recommendations is that there is too little coordination between various agencies when they're all supposed to be rowing in the same direction. So this is something that the governor's office, the administration, should focus on and emphasize in order to make sure that we're all singing the same tune.
Yeah, it can't be said enough. I want to thank our guest, Pedro Nava, the chairperson of the state's Little Hoover Commission, and thank you for joining us. If you want to stay current with state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.